Can preachers get married? The cost of following Jesus, and what's my job? Today on another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through Matthew chapter 8 verses 14 through 34 and also Mark chapter 4 and 5. Now tomorrow's reading is Matthew chapter 9 and 10 if you want to get a jump start on that for tomorrow. So, what do we got today? In Matthew chapter 8, we're going to start here in verse 14, and this was very interesting here. Right off the bat, it says Jesus went to Peter's house and saw his mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. So, mention of Peter's mother-in-law here confirms that Peter was married, does it not? And his marriage was foundational to Paul's argument that apostles had the right to marry and to have their wives accompany them in missionary labors as well, when he talked about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. And we'll get into that later in another video. We get to verse 16 here, and Jesus is driving out spirits by command here. Now, his ability to drive out spirits by command stands in contrast to the drastic measures that the Jewish exorcists would use. Now, there were exorcists in Judaism, and they would drive out demons just like Jesus would, but not exactly like Jesus would, because they would use things with very offensive odors, foul smells to run them out. They would use these nose ring things to try to hook the demon to pull it out. They would use all these drastic measures, but Jesus, he would just say, "Get on up out of here," and they would get on up out of here. So it was very interesting how contrasting the two different ways of doing it was. Now, that Jesus could heal all these people who were sick also indicates that no disease could thwart his healing powers. In other words, he could heal anything at all. In verse 17 here, in one sense, Jesus was able to heal physical illnesses because his impending sacrificial death purchased spiritual atonement for sin. What does that really mean? Well, all this sickness is ultimately a consequence of Adam's sinful choice, really, if you think about it. And Jesus could remove all of these consequences because he's going to bear all the penalty for sin on the cross. All this sin that he's taken upon himself is going to be washed away through his death on the cross. In Matthew's application of Isaiah 53 verse 4 here, if you look in verse 17, shows that he understood Jesus' death as an act of substitution or atonement in which Jesus was pierced because of our rebellion and bore punishment for the iniquity of us all, as it says in Isaiah 53 verses 5 and 6. Now, all of this was not without a cost, and it's not without a cost for us today. Following Jesus can involve sacrificing many comforts of home, just as we see in verses 18 through 20. And then, of course, we get to verse 21 and 22. This guy, it says, Lord, another of his disciples says, "First let me go and bury my father," because Jesus told him, "Hey, just follow me." And he said, "Let me go home first and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Look, follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." Now, this demand by Jesus seems kind of harsh to modern readers today, because for today, a funeral would pretty much only be a brief detainment, a short commitment for a day or two, sometimes at the most a week maybe. But in ancient Jewish burials, they would stretch this out over the course of an entire year. So basically, this was this guy saying, give me a year to go and do this. And the way he's speaking about his father, it almost is as if his father's not quite dead yet. Because if his father was dead, he wouldn't have been out in public. He would have been in mourning. He would have been in a mourning scenario where he was confined and he was away from people. He wouldn't have been out and about if his father had just died and he was going to have to bury him. So it's almost as if he's like, let me go home, hang out, wait till my dad dies, and then spend a year through the burial process and the mourning grieving process, then come follow you. So this wasn't just a scenario where he's just like, hey, give me a day. So even though at face value it seems as if Jesus is being super harsh here, but that's really not the case. This was basically this guy trying to make an excuse to not go. So that's pretty much what I got out of this side. So since an obligation to God supersedes obligations to parents here, which is actually mentioned in Jewish tradition in Deuteronomy 13 verses 5 and 6, Jesus assumed a divine prerogative in this teaching right here, basically saying that God comes before any of this earthly stuff, especially a burial scenario. So I'm going to skip forward here from Matthew into Mark chapter 5, because this kind of goes along with the same theme. In Mark chapter 5, we were talking about where Jesus drives demons out, and specifically the legion demon that we had spoke about earlier. And of course, that's also in Matthew, but in Mark's version here, you get to verse 18 of Mark chapter 5, and it says, "As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged him earnestly that he might remain with him." In other words, he wanted to go with Jesus, but Jesus said this. Jesus did not let him in the boat. Instead, he told him, "Go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." So he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and they were all amazed. Now, this kind of leads into, what is our job as Christians? What is our job? Well, people changed by Jesus must tell the world about his miraculous works. And a lot of times we just feel like we should. We should go and tell about it. And Jesus says we should go tell about it. And what is this Decapolis that he speaks of? Well, literally Decapolis means 10 cities. And this refers to a league of 10 Greek cities that are spread throughout Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. And they were predominantly Gentile, so they were not Jewish areas, and they were largely independent from Rome. So basically, this is Jesus sending this guy out as a disciple to tell people about Christ, about God, about what has happened to him in his life. And it's so much more powerful when you go out and you tell people what Jesus has done for you in your life than it is if you go out and say, "Hey, look, Jesus did this for this guy over here, Jesus did this for this guy over here." People aren't really interested in hearing that. They want to know what Jesus has done for you. So it's so important to go out and tell your story about what's going on. As a matter of fact, my wife just talked about that in her sermon yesterday at church. So I found that to be pretty amazing. We're going to flip back into Matthew, and as we were in Matthew chapter 8, verses 14 through 34, we're going to finish up there with, actually we're finished with that. So we're going to go back into Mark. And one of these parables stood out to me in Mark, and it was the parable of the growing seed. And this is in verses 26 through 29. I'm just going to read this real fast because it's super short. It says, "The kingdom of God is like this," he said. "A man scatters seed on the ground. He sleeps and rises night and day. The seed sprouts and grows, although he does not know how. The soil produces a crop by itself. First the blade, then the head, and then the full grain on the head. As soon as the crop is ready, he sends for the sickle, because the harvest has come." So what is this saying? What is this all about? Well, this is exactly what our job is. What is your job as a disciple? Your job is to plant those seeds. The kingdom of God here is what it's relating to. And the seed here, like the seed, God's kingdom contains within itself the power to grow, right? And the only human role is planting it. That's it. From that point, God does the rest of the work, right? Once it's planted, these seeds will grow and become a harvest. And the sickle is a symbol of the final judgment, the last end time, that final harvesting or the judgment day that we read about in Revelation chapter 14, verse 5. I truly enjoyed the reading today. I hope you did too. And I hope this has helped you somewhat in your studies. If it has, click that like button, subscribe button, share it with somebody. And I hope to see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.